Schools to give boys anti-misogyny lessons to stop toxic masculinity in wake of Netflix hit Adolescence. If I was trying to come up with the worst response you could have to this TV show that's only going to exacerbate the problem, that would be it.
Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, has watched this show and is more or less deciding he should be influencing educational policy in the United Kingdom based on a fictional television show.
This show is kind of gaslighting on the real issue. You want to talk about toxic masculinity and misogyny? You're looking in the wrong place.
Hello, and welcome to the Pop Culture Contrarian with Thomas, Sterling, and Andrew.
Hello.
Hey guys.
Before we get started, I want to remind you to go to patriotpostshop.com where you can buy things like this tumbler, which comes pre-stickered with all sorts of great stickers. It's got Psalm 91:1, Psalm 91:2. It's really great. Check it out. Buy this. You can also buy coffee. It's really great. And now we're going to get to our episode. Our topic today is this new Netflix TV show, Adolescence, and what we see as the agenda against young men. So let's start with this TV show, just real quick. So it's a show about this 13-year-old boy who apparently murders a classmate because she won't go out with him. And the gist of the show is that this 13-year-old boy has been radicalized by the online right ecosystem.
Toxic masculinity, the likes of Andrew Tate.
Never say going to bed. Going to bed is emasculate. Cowards need sleep.
Right.
Not specifically mentioned in the show, but that's the idea.
That is the idea. And one term even used for this 13-year-old boy is incel. And just for the record, incel means involuntary celibate. And if that wasn't you at 13 years old, there was probably something wrong.
You think so?
Yeah. Yep.
So I'll just say it. All 13-year-olds should be celibate. That's my stance, and I'm not afraid to say it.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment.
All right, so come on, guys. What's the problem with this show? Why is it such an issue that they're making the show and pointing it in the direction they're pointing it?
Well, I think, of course, the show itself has an agenda, clearly, and many shows do today. But I think the biggest problem here is who is watching it and what they're doing with it.
Yeah.
So, for example, Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, has watched this show and is more or less deciding he should be influencing educational policy in the United Kingdom based on a fictional television show. Now, granted, this show claims to be influenced by real people and real events.
Right. And we'll get to that.
And we will get to that. But we're talking about some policy changes that could completely change the fabric of society in the West.
Yeah. So just to jump in with some of the things Starmer has said, he said he backs the show creators' call for this show to be shown in Parliament and in schools. It's a fictional show.
Yeah.
And they're highlighting a problem they think exists, and maybe they're not entirely wrong, but the framing is completely disingenuous. It's making out that 13-year-old boys are being radicalized online and then going out and killing people. And that's not borne out by the facts, especially not the facts of the cases they allegedly are basing this show on.
Right.
Yeah, I'm wondering the nature of the radicalizing that they're hitting at.
Mm-hmm.
We do know that there are instances of radicalization happening in the West to young men.
Yeah.
But the radicalizing isn't surrounding the topic that this show is focused on.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of where we're seeing what I would say this show is kind of gaslighting on the real issue. It seems to be focusing on there's a long history, especially in the West, documented of serial killers who have a certain proclivity and agenda or motivation, maybe is a better way of putting it, that's been investigated, that has to do with a kind of, you could put it in a nutshell, a hatred of women.
Yeah.
That is not new. And effectively, that's kind of what this show is exposing with this young man, this boy, effectively, is that he is kind of motivated by this anger toward women because he's been rejected, supposedly.
At 13.
Yeah. So that kind of motivation factor is not new to kind of, we know that this exists. What's new about, we could say, what this show seems to be, or at least the reception. I don't care really about the show itself, irrespective, but the reception that evidently it's gotten in the UK amongst the political class. They're
treating it like an
it's a
docudrama. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's where I would put this out there. The UK, at least within the government, they don't want to talk about the biggest crime that's happened over the last decade plus, that yes, it was in the news bits and pieces here and there, but they would rather just not talk about it or try to claim we dealt with it, rather than the fact that it was massive and very problematic, but because it dealt with a certain demographic community within the UK, they don't want to talk about it. That's a real problem, a much bigger problem than whatever this faux incel murder spree kind of thing is what they're trying to propagate or promote as this, quote, the big misogyny problem that is coming, or that the UK is supposedly dealing with this young man.
Yeah. So just to highlight the grooming gang issue, this is really one of the big issues here, and it's driven a lot of protests where you ended up seeing a lot of ethnically English people protesting these grooming gangs and then getting arrested for their protests, actually. But the people who are behind the grooming gangs have largely been let off scot-free. Just to be clear, hundreds, possibly thousands, according to Liz Truss, former Prime Minister of the UK, of young ethnically English women, girls, have been groomed and raped by these gangs of not entirely, but majority Muslim. And it's actually driven because of Muslim practices and behavior towards women.
Well, it's, you want to talk about toxic masculinity and misogyny. You're looking in the wrong place.
Mm-hmm. Well, sort of. So we're talking about this online right ecosystem that's kind of, in some cases, maybe radicalizing young men. Well, the chief example everyone would point to is Andrew Tate.
Sure. Right.
And what religion is Andrew Tate?
He's a Muslim.
I see a lot of people, and I think there's a dadgum Muslim. I wonder what kind of bomb.
He's a Muslim.
Well,
and he's also a terrible person.
He's also a terrible person.
Yeah, I don't believe he's a very devout Muslim, but whatever.
But his view and treatment of women aligns largely with Muslim view and treatment of women, especially as seen in these grooming gangs.
At least the grooming gangs. Okay. Yeah. It's hard to paint with such a broad brush, but in general, we can say, yes, there are within that culture we saw, at least within this UK, and it was specifically actually within a certain ethnic group within the UK, it was Pakistani.
Yeah.
And so,
again, not exclusively, but clearly.
Right. That was predominantly within that subculture, you could say.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's what this is the point. You want to deal with what you're calling toxic masculinity.
That's toxic.
But where it's the worst, you don't want to touch it.
Right. And you won't even prosecute the actual rapists, which is just crazy.
Yeah.
And then, so there's another issue with this show that we haven't touched on yet, which is that this show is based on several real life stabbings, because knife crime is the thing they're cracking down on in England. And I guess there has been an increase in knife crime, possibly just in recording the data, but in that, you do see a sharp increase in the amount of knife crimes recorded.
And that's a thing worth noting, but just a quick data point here. I think it's worth saying that the UK has one of the lowest violent crime rates in the first world. Definitely less than the United States. It's about it's about 1.4 per every 100,000 people.
What's the US?
It's
5?
4.9. No, it's practically
it's 5. Oh,
yeah. And violent crime typically is measured by homicide. There are some variables that differ between countries, but for the most part, I think it's one of the more apples and apples statistics we can use. Actually, sexual crime is a little bit more difficult to nail down because countries measure that widely differently.
And y'all are going to push back on me, but I think what I'm saying is true. A lot of the recording has to do, think about with these grooming gangs, where all these people who actually have committed mass rapes in many cases haven't been brought in and taken to court and imprisoned over this.
Yeah.
That's not entering into the statistic.
Correct. See that, and that's totally a relevant point to say, when it's not getting recorded,
right,
that's going to skew the numbers.
Yeah.
And the violent crime is more or less, from what we understand, reported fairly similarly.
Yeah.
At least between United Kingdom and the United States.
Just going back to knife crime, though. So the number I have here in front of me, and this is from Grok, so it could be wrong, is like 24,000 in 2014 up to a pretty consistent 50,000 in the past 5 years or so.
So knife crime is a thing that's increasing.
At least the recording has increased.
Reporting of it,
Yeah. So, but ultimately, while that, if knife crime is increasing, that's something the United Kingdom needs to consider. But also another thing to consider is if your overall violent crime is lower and consistently lower, and it has continued to be lower on an aggregate over the years, over the past 10 to between 10 and 30 years, if I remember. Yeah. Right. It's been on the way down. So the question is, are you really looking in the right place for your overall societal problems?
And on that note, the other issue here is that one of these specific knife crimes that they've cited as inspiration for this story that they're doing, where a 13-year-old ethnically English boy, he's as pasty as you could hope for. Like if you think of stereotypical English boy, this is who you're going to think of. Stabs a girl who's like a year or two older than him, who's also obviously very English looking.
Yeah.
Well, one of the actual crimes they used as inspiration for this show was Hassan Sentamu, a 17-year-old boy who was an immigrant or descendant, a child of immigrants.
Yeah, he was first generation.
First generation, who murdered 15-year-old, younger than him, Ilian Andam, who is, I don't know if she was an immigrant, but the point is neither of these people were ethnically English.
Yeah.
They were of different ethnicities, and we'll let you guess. But the point is that the justice system in the UK is unwilling to address the people or the groups that are the demographics, let's say, who are largely committing these crimes. And then they're pretending it's a completely different demographic. And so like you're never going to get the right answer when you won't even look at the problem in the face.
Why?
Why won't you get the right answer?
No, why do you think they're doing this?
I think they've bought into really the idea that specifically white people in the UK are largely responsible for the things that happened under the British Empire, and that they have all this unearned privilege from all the stuff they stole all over the world. And so they have to let all the people from all their former colonies come into their country. And then they've lost the ability to say, actually, there's some areas where your culture is inferior and you need to assimilate. And if you don't belong here. They've lost the ability to say that.
Yeah. What we're seeing is the result of a postmodern mindset, because there is no objective, absolute truth. And when you buy into that, then there's only your truth versus somebody else's truth. And in that sphere, nobody gets to have a, quote, higher truth than somebody else.
Right.
And so the fear is, well, we don't want to be labeled racist because, that's the worst possible thing. And so what we'll do is we'll do our best to effectively try to avoid it. And if it comes from one specific group, let's say whites, we're going to be extra aggressive to make sure we stomp out any potential racism from that group. If it's another group that is acting in a racial manner, we'll explain it away, because it too it's not racism, but there'll be a defense of it, at least in the sense of an understanding of why they may engage in this criminal behavior. But it's not because they're motivated by race. It's because of oppression. And this is where I think what's moved into a lot of Europe, and it's because Europe is in a lot of ways socialist.
Yep.
It's embraced this kind of neo-Marxist ethic where it sees oppressor class and oppressed class. And if you are in the oppressor class, you don't have a defense. You are automatically guilty.
Anything that's taken from you and given to an oppressed class, that anytime that happens, that's justice.
Yeah. And if you're in an oppressed class, then your behavior is going to be looked at through that lens. And so there's going to be an effort to explain it and rationalize it, not necessarily defend it in itself, but seek to look at the individual engaged in that and say, okay, what would have motivated them in this? And somehow it's going to be connected to them being oppressed.
Yeah.
And on the reverse, we're not going to try to dig into and explain why you would engage in bad behavior in this sense. You're just acting out your natural bad motivation and you need to be condemned for it.
Yeah. And that we're seeing play out in media and then in downstream in politics.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, policy saying we're going to make everybody watch this show and it's going to inform the education of even as young as 9 years old. I don't know that they'd be watching this show in particular at 9 years old, but they're going to be talking about this subject matter as young as 9 years old. And then further, slightly different subject within the same context, Starmer has praised and more or less will uphold essentially British law that will lower the overall consequences of legal ramifications on more or less oppressed class people, excluding white males.
Yeah.
And that's going to be law.
Yeah. It's going to be law tomorrow. So before this episode comes out, it will be the way cases in the UK are treated. But just to clarify, I think Starmer is actually technically on the record against this new practice.
Is he?
Yeah. But he has so far been unwilling to do the only thing he could forcefully do, which is just, let me pull it up.
He is a white dude.
He is a white dude. Yeah. He's guilty of stuff. So he has the ability to scrap the Sentencing Council, which is the group doing this new policy that I'll explain a little bit more. But he hasn't done that, even though he's saying all options are on the table because it's going to create differential treatment. But I don't have the exact article right here, but I read it. The new sentencing is going to have this, I forget exactly what they call it, but it's basically a prejudgment based on the race and other either immutable or what are considered immutable characteristics in society today. So that's going to be race, gender, orientation, religion, etc. And basically, if you are a person of color, if you are LGBTQ, if you are a woman, if you are a pregnant woman, if you are, I don't know why they're differentiating those things, except I guess they believe that men can become women. Yeah. And if you're from a minority religion, which means Islam, then your sentencing will automatically basically be lowered because of those factors before your case is even brought to the court. And if you listen to the list I just said, the group that's left out are Christian, white, male, English people. Mm-hmm. So they're going to be getting the normal sentence and everyone else is going to be getting a less harsh sentence than them. And that is going into effect tomorrow. That will be the way cases are treated as of tomorrow, April 1st, which is...
Yeah. Well, and that plays out in this TV show where the focus is he's a boy, but a stereotypical white Englishman.
Yeah.
Well, it's like we learned nothing from the civil rights movement, honestly, because the whole emphasis of the civil rights movement is the problem was you had groups of people judged negatively based purely upon their ethnicity.
And groups judged positively.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But the worst part was the negative judgment. Yeah. And the whole point is we are all one human race and we come in different colors. And the fact of the matter is those colors don't differentiate value one iota. And unfortunately, the racists want to use that to differentiate value. And they do. And this is a classic example. A justice system that's a just justice system uses the same standard for every human being based upon the fact that they're a human being and nothing else. That's the standard. It doesn't matter what you look like. It matters that this is a standard and either you are guilty of the crime or you're not. And nothing else should come into it to say, well, because you look this way, we're going to not give you as harsh a penalty, or because you look this way, you're going to get the book thrown at you. I mean, because
they would say we're going to lower the penalty because you're a product of your society or your culture or
whatever the justification may be. They'll come up with whatever. The racists always have a way of justifying their racism. They always do. It was the same back with in the KKK days and the Jim Crow days. They had a rationale for why they engaged in anti-black racism.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it was right, but they're going to have a rationale. And just because they have a rationale to debate doesn't change the fact that it's just pure racism.
Right. Well, the point I was going to make is you can see the hypocrisy here because I think it's all one movement. It's this postmodernism married to Marxism, which is like, it's
the woke movement.
Well, it's the woke movement, but it's aligned with the Islamic immigrants in the West. They have made an alliance.
Because that's the oppressor.
Right.
Right. Because they are the minority group.
They are the minority groups, anyhow.
Quickly, that is changing.
For now, they're the minority groups. We'll see how they behave when they're the majority. It's not going to be the same. But these woke people will tell you, oh, your racist grandpa, or your grandpa said something racist at Thanksgiving dinner. You can't talk to him anymore. And you might defend him saying, well, he's a product of his time. And they would say that doesn't matter. But when it's a product of, oh, I'm from Somalia and in my culture, we do shoot people all the time, then, oh, well, that's a product of your culture. So that's okay. It's a clear double standard.
There's an inconsistency. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the problem is the racists decided to go and say, how can we change what racism means so that we can be racists? I mean, I feel like it seems simplistic, and that is a simplistic way. But what happens is the world, because it's fallen, is not fair. It just isn't. And so you're going to have people who, without anything that they have done, have advantage, socioeconomically, physiologically, all kinds of ways over people who don't have advantage. And some people look at that and say, that's not fair. We got to do something about it to, quote, level the playing field, make it fair. Mm-hmm. The only person who can actually do that justly is God. And when you are saying it's not fair, we need to do something fair about it, what you're doing is saying, I'm going to play God. I'm going to step in here and I'm going to make it fair. And invariably, when we do that, we don't end up with heaven, we end up with hell. And I think that, unfortunately, the more the West has dug into secularism, which by nature rejects God, you end up with these kind of efforts to try to quote fix the problems in the world when you can't even actually identify what this actual source of the problems are.
Well, and not to go down a rabbit hole, because I have another point I want to make, but when you can't even say that men can't become women, that's a litmus test. When you tell me a man can become a woman, okay, I know you're never going to be able to identify a real problem because you can't even acknowledge basic biological truth.
You can't, you don't even know the truth.
But to not get sidetracked, to go to the point I was going to make that ties into what you were saying. If you think about it like ecosystems, right? Like a fish is going to do best in a pond. It's not going to do well in a desert. It's just not. The fish is adapted to the pond, and the rattlesnake is adapted to the desert. And if you put the rattlesnake in the pond, it's not going to do well. Well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say all cultures, all peoples belong anywhere they want to be. Well, England for 2,000 years, 4,000, however far back you want to go, has been the place where the English people have been adapted to survive, because that's where their ancestors are from. That's the culture they know. That's the systems that the English people have built are the ones that exist in England. And when you try to bring in people from other cultures, other ecosystems, and you try to say, okay, these people from India or Somalia or America or Argentina are having worse results, so we need to equalize this. What you're doing is you're trying to say we got to equalize this ecosystem. And you can't do that. It's not going to work, because some people are going to be more adapted to certain cultures in certain places than others. And that's not a value judgment. That's just a judgment on how adaptation works.
It's kind of, I guess what you're kind of saying is like when you bring in, just to use, nature as an example, when you bring in, I just watched a documentary on this actually, the Great Lakes.
Yeah.
They had a lot of lake trout. The lower lakes, I think it was Ontario, had salmon. And then as European settlers moved in and everything, the fishing industry really built up around these lakes and everything. And suddenly the number of fish started to decrease significantly. And they were trying to figure out what's going on. Are we overfishing? That was part of it. But what they really actually determined was a parasitic species had moved in. And
is this the lamprey?
Yep. Yeah. And the lamprey, it was a sea lamprey, which was out in the ocean's not a problem for the bigger fish. But when you bring it into these lakes, it was devastating, the fish numbers. And what they couldn't figure out was, how did the sea lamprey get up to all these other lakes? Because Niagara Falls, there's no way they could have passed. Well, they think they determined was, at one point they built a canal between, Huron and Erie.
The Erie Canal is the famous one.
Right.
I think that goes to the Hudson River, though. Anyhow.
Anyway, so that is how they think the lamprey got in there and just started decimating all the fish. And it wasn't until they could control that species. Now, if you, given your example, now you've got to be kind of careful with this, but given your example, what you're saying is, if you have two different cultures meeting and one culture is going to say, we have no problem taking over this other culture that's weaker, what you're evidently going to happen is that other culture is going to die out.
Right.
And so that's the question. That's the wrestling match. And what the postmodernist has bought into is this notion that all cultures are somehow equally good, equally just, equally right. And so in a globalist kind of utopian vision, it's kind of like the Star Trek world, where you have all these different groups of people and somehow they all have these different cultures, but then they all somehow get along. Yeah.
The idea is that if you make these cultures intermix enough, eventually you'll get to some homogenous, basic human culture, which that's not a thing. It doesn't exist. The other aspect of this that we haven't gone into is, we've talked about the racism. We haven't talked about the sexism.
Yeah.
So that's the other part of this, where because they're trying to correct for outcomes and they're trying to correct for historical imbalances, what they are saying to especially young men in schools is, oh, for 200 years, the British Empire ruled the planet and it was all white men who were doing it. So now we need to empower anyone who's not a white man, just like in this court system that we were talking about. And like the killer in this TV show is a 13-year-old boy. A 13-year-old boy was born in 2012. I don't know if you know this, but in 2012, white men didn't enjoy significant systematic advantages over other people in England. And so I think part of something they are genuinely tapping into is this online radicalization. And it does happen. Yeah. I don't think it's happening to 13-year-olds.
It starts.
I'm sure it starts there, but I don't think, anyhow.
Yeah, the question is like, A, how widespread really is this? And B, is it really such a huge influence? Because, I mean, the likes of Andrew Tate, young men should not be listening to Andrew Tate.
But a lot are.
That's kind of where I was going, is I think I can explain why young men are listening to Andrew Tate.
Okay.
Or all sorts of other people like Daryl Cooper, who we've trashed on this podcast several times, and we will continue to, because he said Churchill's the chief villain of World War II.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, it was Hitler.
It was, yeah.
But people like him, and then people unrelated to him online, I'm starting to see people say things like, some are paraphrasing here, Hitler was misunderstood. I'm like, I think we understand him pretty well. He wrote a book. But I think what we're seeing happening is these 13-year-old boys or 20-year-old boys who've been raised since the turn of the millennium have constantly lived in a world where they're told the future is female, white men need to step back and be quiet and let other people lead. And they're like, well, I had nothing to do with anything that happened in the 1900s because I wasn't alive then. And I'm really kind of tired of being told I'm responsible for things that happened before I was born, and that I am guilty for things that happened before I was born. And so I think there is this instinct to, okay, either I fight back or I let myself be ground into dust, broke into the system. And I think they're saying, I'm not going to let myself be broken into the system. And one of the people who refuses to break to the system and talks about how great men are is Andrew Tate.
Sure.
And his message is wrong. And I think he's ignoble and uncharitable and unchivalrous. But his message is men should stand up for themselves.
Yeah.
And a lot of young men don't hear that anywhere else. And so there are better influencers out there who will give out that same message. But Andrew Tate is understandably a lightning rod, and so he gets a lot of attention. And so I think the fact that he is enjoying this popularity is a result of these young men's refusal to be ground down and broken into the system.
Well, another example of just what you're talking about, Sterling, is the rise of Jordan Peterson.
Right.
He is, I mean, by and large, men listen to him.
Yeah.
In part, is because I think he became popular on YouTube, and the demographics of our YouTube are like 80% plus men.
Right. That's what he says. Yeah.
But I think that has carried on far outside of YouTube because he is extremely popular with young men. And by and large, I would say he has a really positive and healthy message to give to young men.
Stand up straight, clean your room, take responsibility for yourself. Those are great messages.
Well, this problem has been one that has been with us for a while, and sadly it's increased, and it's a problem of fatherlessness, really. Yes. That's the root of it. Because young men need that close male role model in order to actually mature and to develop an understanding and an identity of what it means to be a man and who they are. And when their father's absent, they can have great mothers, but their mother cannot fill that role.
A mother can't teach a son how men should treat women.
Right.
She can't teach him that.
You know, there's instructions and stuff like that. But the point is, the solution isn't to try to emasculate men more and turn them all into soy boys to try to somehow get rid of, quote, toxic masculinity. And the irony is, the reason I would argue that Andrew Tate has become popular within a segment of these boys is because you have pushed this. And so they're going to react because they're boys and see, I want something that's not going to, you know, for lack of a better term, sissify me.
Right.
And this is what you're going to get. You're going to get some of these genuinely toxic males like Tate, who he enjoys being a bully. He enjoys kind of pushing the boundaries and telling men to basically behave like he did and to use women as objects, not as seeing them as fellow human beings, females, but fellow human beings that they're to respect and love. He pushes this kind of aggressive you could almost say it's a bit of like a Genghis Khan type of mentality. Your job as a man is just to be a destroyer and a ruler. That's the message he says. And when you have men who have a natural desire and a natural motivation to be strong and to be aggressive, that's not toxic.
Right.
When you have that and you naturally want to express that, that's why boys love sports so much. If it's being constantly pushed against and pushed against and pushed against,
if the system is designed to punish those traits,
eventually you're just, if you don't make a distinguishing, if you define that as toxic, guess what? They aren't going to be able to differentiate between Tate and somebody else who like Peterson.
Yeah. And that's exactly what they're doing. You alluded to it earlier, Andrew, but just to read this headline from dailymail.com, which is maybe not the best source, but the headline's true. Schools to give boys anti-misogyny lessons to stop toxic masculinity in wake of Netflix hit Adolescence. If I was trying to come up with the worst response you could have to this TV show that's only going to exacerbate the problem, that would be it. That's just going to make it worse. It won't help at all.
Yeah. No, you're guaranteeing the problem get worse.
For sure. If you think that toxic masculinity, if you really do believe that this online toxic masculinity, far right extremist incel culture is actualizing widespread violence in the world, if you really believe that, and I think in some cases it may be, then by crushing those groups more, by doing more to them that has driven them to these ends, you know, that's like the beatings will continue until morale improves.
Right. It's like it's like if you were out in Siberia and you caught a fever. I know that's not how fevers work, but we're going to stretch this a little bit. You catch a fever in Siberia because you've been out in the cold. You come inside and you're like, oh man, I've really got this fever. I better go outside where it's cold so I can cool off. It's like you're doubling down on the thing that caused the problem to begin with. And that's what this is. It's somehow they're watching the show and they're like, oh, the problem is we haven't cracked down on young men enough. Yeah. We haven't taught them to hate masculinity enough.
One of the things too that, you know, I think what we're seeing as a product, this is a product of feminism being fully expressed in a culture. Feminism is primarily motivated by emotive over the rational. It doesn't mean it's irrational, but it means that emotive matters feelings matter.
It's a more feminine mindset.
The thing about it is, for males in general, it's not that we don't have feelings, obviously.
I don't have any feelings.
But we have naturally are more bent toward ideas and thoughts and acting on those. That's why they tend to say women are more focused on relationships. Men are more focused on objects or things, building things, making things, using tools, etc. And so what's happened is the response to this is a very feminist kind of way of responding to something. This show evokes emotion. There's no doubt that it does. So because this evokes so much emotion, they think, well, then we should do something about it, rather than to stop and say, let's think about this logically and actually think rationally and say, is this really a problem? Or is this a drama we're watching that we're just somehow applying to society without actually looking at the data, actually asking a question, actually saying, is this an accurate depiction of what our society looks like?
Mm-hmm. But even if you accept it's a real problem, even if this was a documentary about a 13-year-old boy who did this.
Yeah.
And you think, okay, a 13-year-old boy got radicalized by these people online and then murdered a classmate who rejected him on a date, rejected going out on a date with him. Surely the response is to teach other boys like him not to hate women and to not be toxically masculine. Surely that's the answer. And the answer isn't instead, present a positive vision of masculinity.
Yeah, it's like this. If you have a strong-willed child, and this applies to both boys and girls, the way that you deal with them is not to crush their spirit.
Yeah.
It is to direct them in a positive way. It's to empower them with responsibilities and with being able to make decisions for themselves in positive ways and giving them the tools that they need and the opportunities to work through that natural tendency, which I think being strong-willed, I happen to have a strong-willed child, so I know a little bit about this, is extremely positive towards creating strong, good people in the world.
Competency. Right. I mean, you want competent adults.
Yes.
Part of the problem we're suffering from is we have a bunch of adults that are incompetent in our culture. And instead of recognizing, hey, just teaching the feelings doesn't actually develop competency, maybe we need to recognize, okay, we need to toughen up, recognize the place of feelings have, but also recognize that they aren't what guide us.
Right. But also there's a basic psychological principle here with regards to this misogyny that they are alleging is this huge problem that's leading to the knife crime, which is, again, that's every step of that is wrong. But if you assume this misogyny is such a bad problem, well, what is it? It's a bad habit, right? It's a bad habit that these boys have of hating women. How do you break a bad habit? Do you break a bad habit by sitting the person with the bad habit down and explaining to them, hey, this is a really bad habit. Here's all the reasons it's bad. Here's the bad outcomes it has. Here's what it's making you do that's bad. That's not how you break the habit. Yeah. You break the habit by replacing it with a good habit. Mm-hmm. So the answer to toxic masculinity is not anti-misogyny lessons. The answer is a positive masculine message.
Yes. And on that note, let's teach our boys to be boys.
Let's teach our boys.
Teach them to be men.
Yeah. Well, I think that's right. Let them be boys when they are boys, but teach them to be men.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's probably why this isn't happening, because we've got a culture that has lost its mind when it comes to recognizing the distinct gender roles in that they do exist and they are sex-based, and that matters. And we should recognize that and understand it rather than run away from it or cry bigotry when someone says, hey, men are men, women are women, they can't change.
And I think it goes beyond gender roles, because a gender role is like the man brings home the bacon and the woman cooks it, right? That's a gender role, but there's also gender nature. Where just the nature, what is masculinity, what is femininity?
Well, and I would say that they're intertwined. Yes,
they're intertwined. But what I'm saying is that it's the nature of masculinity, I think, more than the gender roles of masculinity that are being rejected. Just the way masculinity expresses itself is what the system is built to punish.
Well, yeah, because of the natural roles that come from that. Like, if you're instinctively as a male geared toward being kind of a natural, aggressive protector that follows into a role of what does it mean to be a husband? What does it mean to be a breadwinner? What does it mean to be, fulfilling as a man, as these God-given indwelling instincts that have been placed in you because of who you were born. It's like you're exploring that, but the role of society, and this is where we were talking about England and the society that developed around it. Part of that development on a base level is the roles of men and women within society. Yeah. And what's happened to the West is when it bought into the secularistic view of postmodernism, it basically effectively threw out the notion that there are role distinctions between the sex based on roles. And so when you do that and you try to say, well, those roles are they don't really matter. They're
just traditional.
They're traditions. We need to they're backwards, they always trot out the old Handmaid's Tale. It's what they want to throw you,
But the soft bigotry of low expectations comes in here too, because they hold these young white men to these standards, but these young black men are not held to seemingly any standard at all.
Absolutely, Sterling. Mm-hmm. I mean, this totally disparate difference in standards based on the oppressor-oppressed class. Yeah. We should be advocating for proper nature of men and women, and then irregardless of race, because at the end of the day, men are men, women are women, and the rest is up to merit.
Right. And you can set race aside when you assimilate into a unified culture.
Yeah. Right.
When you have one culture, and everyone's assimilating into it, race is irrelevant. Yeah. When each race is bringing its own culture and practicing its own cultural standards, then race is going to matter, but it's not because of skin color. It's because of those cultural practices. Yeah. And the UK is just unwilling to even begin looking at that side of the equation.
Yeah, it's challenging multiculturalism, and we've talked about this before. But basically, the concept of multiculturalism is flawed.
Yeah. Well, that's the root issue that Adolescence should have been addressing, and it's not at all what they address. Yeah. They decide to go down a complete rabbit trail for something that's not an issue in the way they're pretending it is. And there is an issue they should have been addressing that's much more significant. There is a growing radicalization, I guess, of I think, young men online.
I do think they're fearing that. And I think this is their way of kind of like trying to unpack it. But like you're saying, they're looking at really backwards.
Well, and it's like you've got this wound that might be getting infected, but your jugular vein has been cut and you're bleeding out. And it's like, okay, which one do you focus on first? The wound that's going to be infected or the bleeding out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or just to put it another way, you see you're seeing a wound, but you're not diagnosing the proper way in which to treat the wound.
Right.
And they're seemingly seeing this and saying, oh, this is the way we need to treat it. And it's actually only going to exacerbate the problem.
Yeah. I cannot think of a better way to make this problem worse than the way they're addressing this. Yep. It's really incredible.
The beatings shall continue until morale improves.
Yes, exactly.
On a positive note, it's being talked about.
Yeah.
Yes, it is being talked about. That's true.
So
and that's
step one, right?
Yeah.
Recognize.
I mean, kind of the problem they're trying to address, which, as we've said, is out of line for them because they've got a bigger problem they need to address first. But it is kind of related to some of the problems we've been bringing up on the podcast these past few weeks. It's kind of the same issue.
Yeah.
But when you have mass grooming gangs and stuff, you should deal with that first if you're England. And
yeah. Agreed.
Leave the other stuff to us Americans who are starting to get things figured out. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. So our topic was adolescence and the agenda against young men. We kind of touched on all sorts of aspects of this beyond those, but that's the core of this. This has been the Pop Culture Contrarian episode with Thomas, Sterling, and Andrew. We're brought to you by the Patriot Post, which is the oldest conservative news digest on the web. It's right and it's free. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
See you guys.